My sister always thought she was smarter than me and secretly tried to take control of the family investments worth $5 million. She hoped that I wouldn't find out about the accounts and stocks. I checked the documents and not only recovered my share, but also found hidden investments from my father, another $2 million that he had left only for me. Welcome. I invite you to listen to this story and rate it on a 10-point scale. Please leave your comments. This is very important. After Father's funeral, the air in our town felt different. It became dense, viscous, as if every movement required effort. The road to my childhood home seemed too long, although in reality the journey took only 10 minutes. The gray sky hung low, and the raindrops, sometimes barely noticeable, sometimes splashing stronger on the windshield, created the feeling that nature itself was mourning Father's departure. When I approached the house on the corner of Milford Street, it looked tired, but proud, like an old guardian who had one last step to take before collapsing. On the porch stood Lillian, neat, composed, impeccable. Her black dress was perfectly ironed, her hair gathered in a tight bun, and her posture was strict, almost regal. Even on this day, she looked as if she controlled not only the house but death itself. I stopped at the gate, listening to the rustle of leaves underfoot. We hadn't seen each other for almost a year. Since that evening when Father first spoke about selling the company, and something had broken between us, I felt this tension in every look from Lillian, in every movement of her hands. "You're late," she said evenly, calmly, but with a slight note of reproach. "Traffic," I replied, though I knew it was no excuse. I felt her gaze on me, that unspoken question. "You're late again. Didn't manage again." She nodded and turned to the door. I followed her into the house, where the smell of old books and lavender candles immediately brought me back to childhood. The smell was so familiar that for the first few seconds it seemed as if Father had just stepped into the yard and would return in a minute. But the emptiness of the house was tangible. Every armchair, every chair, the table, everything stood in its place, as if time had stopped here. Lillian passed the living room without looking at the photographs or Father's chair, where he liked to read the newspaper in the morning. "People have already left," she said without turning. "Only Mr. Eldridge and a couple of neighbors remain. They're waiting for you in the kitchen." Mr. Eldridge, Father's lawyer, always evoked in me both trust and slight fear. He was almost 70, but he kept a straight posture and a piercing gaze that never missed anything. He always came to us with a smile that, nevertheless, did not hide the seriousness of his character. "Hannah," he said when I entered, "please accept my condolences." "Thank you," I forced out, feeling the lump in my throat squeeze every word. "Your father was a wise man," he continued. "We'll talk later when everything settles down a bit." I nodded, trying to catch my breath, but behind me, the door clicked softly. Lillian disappeared, leaving me with a sense of emptiness. She had never been able to be near when things got difficult, and it always left me alone with my thoughts. Mr. Eldridge and I sat in silence, and a feeling of expectation hung in the room, as if every object could witness some secret. He said the will would be read in a week, and Father had arranged everything meticulously. I felt relief, order in chaos, but it was short-lived. As soon as I left the kitchen, the feeling of anxiety wrapped around me again. On the stairs, I noticed Lillian standing with a phone at her ear. She spoke quietly, but quickly, as if hurrying to hide her words. Hearing my steps, she went silent and turned. "Who were you talking to?" I asked cautiously, trying not to show my own agitation. "The accountant," she replied too quickly. "We need to close the accounts before any legal procedures begin." "Already?" I was surprised. "Father passed away only 2 days ago. We need to act in time," she said, looking past me. "He would have wanted it." I felt tension grow inside me. Father trusted her more than me, and it was always noticeable. Lillian was responsible, smart, organized, and I the younger one, the one who seeks herself. But now, standing in this empty house, I realized for the first time that her role was not just habit but strategy. In her voice, there was no grief, only cold, business-like efficiency. Later, at dinner, I tried to talk about him, about how he had been in the last months, how every morning he rose at dawn and walked in the garden. "Did he tell you a lot?" I asked softly. "Sometimes," Lillian replied. Mostly about business. And about me? I asked almost in a whisper. She smiled. About you? No. It seems he thought you didn't want to be part of it. By that word she meant everything. Business, investments, family. I felt like I was on the sidelines, watching their adult life. That evening it became clear. She was already planning her moves, and I had to be vigilant. We finished dinner in silence. Then Lillian went upstairs, saying she wanted to sort through the documents. I was alone. The house seemed to exhale. A draft ran through the corridor, the old curtains trembled. I approached Father's study. Everything was in place, neat stacks of paper, a desk lamp, a clock stopped at 11:42. I sat in the chair, placed my hands on the desk. In the drawer lay envelopes, papers, notes, all neatly signed. Only one folder was missing. I sat on the edge of the chair, clenching my hands into fists. The empty space in the drawer felt foreign, alien, as if someone had already walked through my memories and left them in disarray. I ran my fingers over the desk, feeling the rough surface. Father always said details mattered, and I realized for the first time that this absence was a detail of his life about which I had never been told. At that moment, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Lillian came down, her face calm, but her eyes could not hide a slight tension. "Hannah," she said evenly, calmly, but with a faint note of cold warning. "Are you going to check the documents?" I nodded, though I still didn't know where to begin. "I want to know what Father left," I said softly. "I want to figure it out myself." "Figure it out yourself," she raised an eyebrow. "He always said he trusted you." "Trusted," I repeated, feeling something burn inside me. "You know he trusted you. It's just, you rarely show initiative." "Lillian," I said a little louder, "this is not about showing initiative, it's about knowing the truth." She pushed aside the folder with papers, walked to the desk, and placed her hands on it. "Truth," she said slowly, stretching the word as if testing my reaction, "is always subjective." "No, truth is what is," I replied, feeling my voice tremble. "Everything else is conjecture and gossip." She smiled. Not the smile of a sister, but something icy, professional, honed. "You think about many things, Hannah. I know." "Think." I clenched my teeth a little. "I just want to know where our family put its values." "Values," she repeated, "are what we choose ourselves. Not everything Father left was meant for you." I froze. Each of her words landed like a quiet but sure blow. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to hide the tremor. She took a step back and looked at me with a slight reproach. "Father made choices for all of us. I'm the older one, I know how to handle them. You..." She fell silent, as if wanting to soften the words but unable to. "You understand what I mean, don't you?" I nodded even though my heart pounded faster. I realized that her calmness was not a mask but a strategy. She had been planning her moves for a long time, and now I was only a piece on her board. I returned to the desk and opened the drawer where Father kept his personal records. Among the papers I found old letters, half-erased figures, notes about meetings with banks and investors. My heart skipped a beat. Everything pointed to hidden accounts that Lillian had not mentioned. I shuffled envelopes, opened records, cross-checked numbers. Every small discrepancy felt like a cry of betrayal. Suddenly, someone knocked on the study door. "May I come in?" It was Mr. Eldridge. I nodded. He came over, examined the papers carefully, and said, "Everything is in order, Hannah, but some items require verification." I felt a flame ignite inside me. Verification. It was not just a word. It was a chance to see what Father had left to me and what had been intended for Lillian. "Thank you, Mr. Eldridge," I said, feeling my breath quicken. He nodded and left, leaving me alone with the paper traces of the past. I sat back down, took one of the folders, and began to leaf through the pages. On every number I felt Lillian's hand. Neat, almost imperceptible, she had tried to adapt everything to herself. But I noticed inconsistencies. Everywhere I looked, missing records, altered signatures, hints at secret accounts. I stood up, went to the window, and looked out. The gray sky hung heavy, the houses seemed empty. The wind stirred the branches, and each creak felt like a warning. I realized the game was just beginning. Lillian had wanted to deceive me, but she had underestimated me. Her cold smile, her confidence, all of it was before my eyes like a challenge. I clutched the folder in my hands, and whispered to myself, I will find out the truth, and I will not let her take what belongs to me. At that moment, I felt for the first time that I could control the situation. My heart raced, but my mind was clear. Silence settled in the house again. Lillian was surely already planning her moves, but now I had a plan too. I didn't know all the figures, but I knew one thing. Father had left me a chance to restore justice, and I would take it. I closed the study door, feeling the warm air from the lamp mix with the cold breath of the autumn evening. Lillian sat on the living room sofa, legs crossed, holding an envelope of papers. Her gaze was piercing, as if she were trying to look straight into my soul. I felt a slight tremor in my hands, but determination gripped my heart even tighter. You're at the documents again, she said evenly, with barely noticeable irony. Not tired of these papers yet. Papers aren't a joke, Lillian, I replied calmly, trying to control my voice. This is our inheritance, and I want to understand what Father left. Inheritance, she smirked, slowly turning the envelope in her hands. You think it's only yours. I felt a wave of irritation and anxiety rise inside me. I'm not saying it's only mine, I said firmly, but I want to know the truth. Lillian tilted her head slightly, studying me. Truth, she drawled with cold interest. And how do you define what truth is? I define it by facts, I answered. And I'm going to find them. She smiled, but that smile was icy, like a knife sliding across glass. Facts, Lillian said, are interesting, but sometimes facts need interpretation. You know how Father did it. I clenched the envelope in my hands, feeling its roughness, as if the material sensed the tension between us. Interpretation isn't deception, I said. But hiding information, that's a whole different matter. She stood and approached me slowly, almost gracefully, and in that moment I realized she intended to dominate psychologically. Hannah, she said softly but firmly, we both know how Father handled his affairs. I'm the older one, I know what to do. And sometimes you trust too easily. Trust too easily. I felt a rush of adrenaline flood my face. I'm not trusting, I just want to know what is real and what you're trying to hide. Lillian stopped a step away from me, her eyes narrowing. Hide, she repeated with a slight smirk. Hannah, I think you see where there's nothing. Sometimes it's better not to look for confirmation, just accept what is. No, Lillian, I said firmly. I won't accept what I don't know. I want to see the whole picture, no matter if you like it or not. She froze, and a silence hung in the room. Every movement seemed louder than usual. The ticking of the clock, the rustle of paper, the creak of the parquet. I saw her lips twitch slightly, as if searching for words to stop me, but she didn't find the right ones. All right, Lillian said finally. Look, but remember, not everything is as obvious as it seems. Sometimes the truth is just part of a bigger game. I nodded, feeling the inner chill and tension squeezing my chest. This game was only beginning. Every word, every movement of hers, like a chess move that needed to be calculated. I realized, if I made a mistake, I could lose more than just money. Hannah, she continued slightly softer, but with a clear undertone of threat, be careful. Too many questions can destroy not only plans but relationships as well. I sighed, trying to push away the wave of anxiety. Relationships, I repeated to myself. With you, they seem already destroyed, Lillian. She studied me, examining every facial feature, every movement of my hands, as if trying to predict my reaction. I felt my resolve strengthen. If she thought she could control me, she was wrong. I'm not looking for conflict, I said, leaning slightly forward. I'm looking for the truth. Truth, she smirked, is sometimes more dangerous than lies. I went silent, feeling a plan form in my mind. I needed to act carefully, step by step, but confidently. Lillian would try to control my every move, but now I knew I would not let her. I stood and approached the desk where Father's papers lay. Each envelope, each record felt like pieces of a puzzle. I took them one by one, checking the numbers, dates, signatures. The deeper I delved, the clearer it became. Lillian had indeed tried to outsmart me, but I was ready. I took the first step, systematized the documents, highlighted suspicious accounts, noticed discrepancies in signatures. Each small success gave me confidence. I realized the game was only beginning, and now I had a map of action. Sitting at the desk, my thoughts jumped rapidly from one idea to another. Every opened letter, every envelope with bank documents felt like a puzzle piece Lillian had tried to hide. I realized she had long planned to take the larger share of the inheritance, and this became clear not only from her actions, but also from the words she spoke with that icy smile. "Hannah," came a quiet but confident voice of Lillian from the living room. "You've been at those papers too long. Don't obsess over the details." "Details, Lillian?" I looked up. "This isn't about details. This is our life, our money, our family." She approached me slowly, almost theatrically. "Family," she repeated, "sometimes requires sacrifices. Are you ready for that?" I clenched the envelopes in my hands, feeling their weight. "Ready," I said firmly. "I want to understand who tried to hide what." She smirked and took a step back, as if playing chess with me. "All right," Lillian said. "Check, but remember, not everything you see will be the truth. Sometimes truth hides as a lie." I nodded and returned to the documents. Each record, each signature, every bank, everything demanded attention. I noticed inconsistencies in one folder. Dates, signatures, and amounts differed from what I knew about the family accounts. My heart raced. I was close to uncovering what Lillian had tried to hide. Suddenly the study door opened and Mr. Eldridge entered. "Hannah," he said, "I heard about your review. Father wanted you to understand all the details. Don't rush, check carefully." "Thank you, Mr. Eldridge," I replied. "I want to be sure nothing is missed." He nodded and left, leaving me alone. The silence of the study immersed me in concentration again. I returned to the documents and noticed a separate envelope labeled "For Hannah Only." My hand trembled as I opened it. Inside were papers with figures Lillian didn't know about. $2 million, which Father had left exclusively to me. At first, I couldn't believe it. It was a real discovery. The moment felt like an electric shock. A feeling of triumph mixed with anxiety flooded through me. I knew Lillian would be shocked if she found out. But for now, she knew nothing. I closed the envelope and placed it in a separate folder. I needed to act cautiously, step by step. I organized the evidence, made notes, cross-checked the numbers. Each discovered fact strengthened my confidence. Now I had full control over what Father left me, and Lillian received only the portion she expected, but considering my new findings. "Interesting," a familiar, cold voice sounded behind me. "Do you really think you can outsmart me?" I turned. Lillian stood in the study doorway, hands on her hips, her gaze sharp as a knife. "I'm not trying to outsmart you," I said evenly. "I just want to see the truth." "Truth," she repeated with a smirk, "can be more dangerous than you think." I smiled, but that smile was more an inner victory than an outward display. "Then let it be dangerous," I said softly. "I can handle it." Lillian nodded silently and left the study. I was left alone with the documents and the realization. The game had changed. Now I held the plan, and no attempt by Lillian to manipulate me would succeed. I was ready for the next move, and the sense of control gave me strength. I gathered all the folders, organized the documents, and closed the cabinet. My mind was clear. I knew what I was doing, and I knew my sister had underestimated me. That confidence became my shield. And let Lillian think she's leading the game, in reality, move by move, I controlled everything. Evening fell on the house, quiet and dark. The streets outside looked empty, as if all life had stopped. But inside me, energy surged. I knew there were many moves ahead, many trials, but now I had a plan, and I was ready to see it through. Since morning, I had entered the house with the feeling that every step could be the last chance to expose Lillian. The air carried a cold, autumnal stillness, mixed with the scent of old paper and coffee from the kitchen. Mr. Eldridge was already waiting for me in the study, carefully arranging folder after folder of documents in front of him, each of which could hold the key to the truth. "Hannah," he began, barely nodding, "Father did everything very thoroughly. Lillian may not even have seen these documents. If we check everything carefully, I'm confident we can reconstruct the full picture." "I'm ready," I said, clutching my notebook. I need to know who tried to hide what. He nodded, carefully assessing my determination. Let's start with former employees. They saw operations that aren't reflected in the papers. Their memories will help us understand what Lillian was hiding. I looked at the list of names he had placed before me. My heart raced. Each meeting could provide new evidence or turn out to be a trap if Lillian learned about our actions. The first meeting was with Mr. Harris, who had worked with Father on investments and finances. His office was piled with folders, blueprints, and old reports. The smell of old paper and dust filled the room as he looked up at me. "You've come to learn the truth about Lillian," he said quietly, almost in a whisper, "and you must be careful. Some things could be dangerous if revealed at the wrong time." "I'm ready," I replied, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. "Tell me everything you know." He began detailing strange operations, envelopes Lillian took and hid, accounts no one had seen. Every word confirmed my suspicions. I took notes, careful not to miss a single detail. "But there's one thing that's especially important," he said, lowering his voice. "Father left part of the investments only for Hannah. Lillian had no idea about them." My heart beat faster. "How much?" I asked almost in a whisper. $2 million, he said calmly. "This money belongs only to you." Relief mixed with anxiety. 2 million, not just money, but proof of Father's trust and a signal that Lillian had underestimated me. Next was Mrs. Brooks, the former accountant. Her eyes immediately showed she understood why I was there. She spoke about documents that disappeared and reappeared, sums that didn't match official records, and quiet attempts by Lillian to manipulate the system. She thought I wouldn't notice, I whispered to myself as I listened. But I see everything. Each meeting added new pieces to the puzzle, and I gradually built the full picture. Lillian might still try to manipulate me, but now I had evidence and a strategy. When I returned home, Lillian sat on the sofa with a folder of her documents, watching me with a sharp, piercing gaze. "You're learning a lot, Hannah," she said with a barely noticeable smirk. "I hope you understand the game is only beginning." "The game ends when all the cards are on the table," I replied calmly but firmly. "I will know who did what." She frowned but remained silent. Inside, I understood. The next phase of the struggle had begun. Lillian would try to manipulate and distract, but now I had evidence, a strategy, and determination. I returned to the study, spread the folders on the desk, examining each page, every number, every signature. Every new fact strengthened my confidence. I knew, if I acted carefully and systematically, Lillian couldn't hide anything. In the evening, I sat alone, reviewing all the materials, my inner voice repeating, "Now I'm in control, and none of her tricks will work." The next day, I met with several more of Father's former employees. Each conversation revealed additional details: who signed documents, who saw envelopes, who suspected that Lillian was acting secretly. The entire day passed like a long dream, each new piece of information adding tension. "She never thought anyone would see this," one former manager, Mr. Lang, told me. "Lillian always believed everything was under control, and she was wrong," I replied quietly, smiling inwardly. I realized I now had a chance to come out of this game victorious. Every new piece of evidence I recorded in a separate folder, making detailed notes and calculations. It became clear that Lillian not only tried to seize $5 million, but also manipulated some of Father's decisions to conceal her activity. This discovery stirred mixed feelings within me: anger, anxiety, and at the same time, cold satisfaction. Now I had power and understood the full scheme. When I returned home, Lillian was already waiting in the living room. She sat on the sofa with her documents, looking at me with a cunning smile. "You know something," she said quietly, almost smirking. "You're too confident, Hannah." I sat opposite her, spreading my folders on the table. "I know everything, Lillian. Every move you made, every hidden account, every attempt to deceive me." She furrowed her brow slightly, and for a moment a flicker of worry passed in her eyes. "You think you can beat me?" she asked, restraining her emotions. "I'm not trying to beat you," I said firmly. "I'm just doing what I must, and now I know the truth." Lillian remained silent for several seconds, then said, "You think control is in your hands, but the game is not over yet." I sighed, mentally preparing for the next move. "The game only changes when all the cards are on the table," I said, "and I can see them all." This meeting showed me that Lillian was beginning to suspect her actions had been uncovered. She had already tried influencing employees and looking for weaknesses, but now her strategy was too transparent. I knew the next stage would be a psychological game, where every word and every glance would matter. The next day, I met again with Mrs. Brooks and other accountants. I asked them to show me all original documents that could confirm hidden investments. Reading signatures, cross-checking sums, dates of operations, everything fit into a single picture. Lillian had underestimated my attentiveness, and it was obvious. "Hannah," one of the accountants said, "you really understand that you have everything under control. Lillian has no idea her actions are exposed." I nodded, "And she will find out when the time comes." At home, I stayed at the desk late into the night, reviewing all the documents, rereading notes, and making calculations. My inner voice repeated, "Now everything is in my hands." I knew Lillian would try to distract, manipulate, and provoke me, but I had strategy, evidence, and complete clarity. The next day, Lillian tried again to speak with me, but this time her tone was more tense. "You're too confident," she said, passing the study. "This could backfire on you." I looked her in the eyes. "If anyone is mistaken, Lillian, it's you." I knew that every attempt at pressure was useless. I was in control and fully understood the situation. This part of the struggle became pivotal. I recorded every action Lillian took, every reaction, noting thoughts and steps. The strategy was clear. Remain calm, gather evidence, and prepare for the moment when I could act decisively and finally. In the evening, when the house fell into semi-darkness, I sat alone, folders and envelopes spread before me. I knew. Now the game had reached a new level. Lillian had underestimated me, and I held all the cards. The sense of control and inner calm intertwined with a slight anxiety. It was the feeling of a true psychological victory even before the final battle began. Inside, I repeated to myself, "Now everything is under my control, and none of her tricks will succeed." The morning in the house was heavy and oppressive. Rain drummed against the windows, creating the feeling that the whole world was watching what was about to happen. I sat at the desk in the study, surrounded by folders and documents I had been gathering over the past days. Every paper, every signature, every transaction was confirmation that I had not been wrong in my suspicions. Lillian had tried to seize $5 million, and $2 million from father was meant solely for me. My heart pounded, but inwardly I felt a calm determination. In this house, where we had grown up, where every room held memories of childhood, a battle was about to take place, one that could not be lost. I opened the first folder, checking numbers, dates, and signatures, as if each detail were a piece of a puzzle that was about to come together. "Everything is ready," I whispered to myself, feeling a surge of strength. "The moment when everything becomes clear is coming." I called Attorney Eldridge, arranging a meeting with Lillian in the house. The meeting was supposed to be neutral, but every detail of the setting was carefully considered. Each room carried the weight of family history, adding gravity to the upcoming conversation. When Lillian entered the living room, her gaze immediately fell on the stacks of folders on the table. Her smile was cold, but her eyes betrayed tension. "What's this?" she asked, trying to maintain a confident tone. I stood, slowly approaching the table. "Everything, Lillian. Every transaction, every signature, every hidden document." I placed the folders before her, speaking calmly but firmly. "I know about your plans and all the investments." Her face went pale and her eyes narrowed. You checked everything," she whispered, as if she couldn't believe her ears. "I checked," I said firmly. "And now I have full confirmation that the $5 million is my share, and the $2 million you didn't even suspect is also entirely mine." Lillian took a step back, as if trying to process what she had heard, but it looked ridiculous. Her confidence had evaporated. "You have no right," she shouted, her voice trembling. I stepped closer, spreading the documents on the table so she could see every detail. "Father left this money only for me, Lillian. Everything you tried to hide is now exposed." I felt cold determination running through me from head to toe. "And now I hold control over the entire sum, all $7 million. She sat on the sofa, her hands shaking, eyes darting between me and the papers. "But I thought," she began, words stuck in her throat. "You thought you could deceive me," I said softly, but every sound of my voice was like a sharp arrow. "All your planning was empty." Lillian fell silent, trying to find arguments, but inwardly she understood she had lost. You saw it all," she finally murmured, barely audible. "I saw and verified everything." I sat opposite her, opening new folders one by one, showing her the hidden accounts and documents she had never suspected existed. "All your planning, every attempt to manipulate or hide something, it's now on the table." Her hands shook harder and her eyes glistened with tears. I saw a mixture of shock, anger, and defeat. "You couldn't have known," she whispered, but I cut her off with a glance. "I knew what you were planning, Lillian, and now I have all the evidence." My inner strength grew with every second. I felt the power completely shift to me. "The game is over." Lillian sat down, lowering her head, trying to hide her tears, but I saw every emotion. This was the moment I had checked everything, analyzed everything, and planned everything for. She realized she had lost completely. I looked at the documents again, at the numbers, at the signatures. Every paper confirmed my victory. But inside, I knew this was only the first stage. Lillian could try to manipulate further, attempt to regain control, but now I had evidence and a strategy that left her no chance. "You thought you could deceive me," I said quietly, watching her struggle to grasp the scale of her defeat. "But now all the cards are revealed, and the power is in my hands." Lillian sat with her head down, silent, but her breathing betrayed her shock. I understood. This was the moment of total shock, psychological and financial. I watched as Lillian tried to comprehend what was happening. Her breathing was uneven, her hands clenched into fists, and her eyes darted between the documents and me. She understood that her plans had collapsed, but stubbornness kept her from fully admitting defeat. She began, her voice trembling. "Are you sure all of this is legal?" "Absolutely," I replied, spreading before her new folders with additional documents confirming not only the $5 million, but also the hidden $2 million left by Father exclusively for me. "Everything is official, Lillian. Every document certified, every transaction verified. All your cunning planning is now exposed and proven." She stared at the folders, as if afraid to touch them. You saw everything and understood it before me." I nodded, my inner determination growing stronger. "Yes, I saw, and now control is completely in my hands." I watched her gaze lose its shine, her confidence melting. "You received only what you expected, and everything you tried to hide is now irretrievable." Lillian sat on the sofa, lowering her head. I saw a mixture of anger and confusion in her eyes. A few seconds of silence felt heavy. The rain outside intensified the sense of confinement, as if the entire house held its breath. She finally whispered. "Are you really that sure?" "Sure," I said firmly. "I checked every account, every document, every signature. Everything is under my control." Inside, I felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, I could see the full picture, understand the consequences of hidden manipulations, and fully reclaim control over the inheritance. She lifted her eyes, which glistened with tears and anger at the same time. "This isn't fair," she shouted. "No, Lillian," I said quietly, but each word struck like a hammer. "It is fair. Father trusted me, and you tried to use the family's trust and weaknesses for your own purposes. Now you see the result." Her shoulders slumped, her hands shook. I knew the moment of total defeat was near. "Everything you could hide, I know. Everything you wanted to claim is now exposed. You got only what you expected and nothing more." I placed the last envelope with official confirmation of the hidden $2 million on the table. "These are all your expectations and illusions." Lillian remained silent, trying not to cry. I saw her pride and vanity crumble simultaneously. In that moment, I understood. She realized she had completely lost control. I stood and approached the window, watching the rain. "Control doesn't mean revenge, Lillian," I said quietly. "Control means understanding. And now I know everything." She lifted her eyes and looked at me. "Hannah," she began, but the words again got stuck. I can't believe it." "You can," I said, turning to her. "You can believe the truth because it is right in front of you." I slowly sat back, watching her breathing even out, though her eyes still reflected shock. "Everything you planned is collapsing, and you see it yourself." Seconds stretched painfully long. I felt the tension built up over all these days gradually subside. Control had been restored, the evidence in place, Lillian in shock. I knew this was only an intermediate moment before the final culmination, but inside I felt satisfaction. "Now you understand, Lillian," I said quietly, "who truly holds power." I watched as she clenched her hands on her knees, realizing that no trick would help her anymore. Her gaze was empty, but there was a hint of acknowledgement in it. This was the moment when the psychological game reached a turning point. She understood defeat, and I had full confirmation of control over the situation and finances. I looked at the documents again, at the numbers, at the signatures. Every envelope, every paper, proof of my victory. But I knew the final battle was still ahead. Lillian could try to regain influence, but now I was ready for anything. In the evening, I sat alone in the study, folders and envelopes spread before me. The rain outside had weakened, but the sense of inner tension remained. I knew the final moment would be both emotional and strategic, and now I had all the resources to complete this story with total victory. Evening had fallen on the house. Long shadows stretched across the living room, and the rain tapped against the windows, each drop seeming to intensify the tension. I sat at the table, stacks of documents laid out before me, each now carrying more significance than just numbers. They were proof that I knew everything and that Lillian could no longer hide her actions. Lillian entered, barely keeping her back straight, as if trying to show that nothing had happened. Her eyes flicked between me and the table, where the folders were neatly arranged. "What's this?" she asked, trying to give her voice confidence, but the tremor in it betrayed her anxiety. I rose and stepped closer, moving slowly, observing her every reaction. "Everything you thought was hidden is now on the table." I took one of the folders and slowly opened it in front of her. "Every account, every signature, every transaction, these are proof of your actions." She froze, her breathing quickening. You checked all of this," she whispered, as if afraid to hear the answer. "I checked," I replied calmly, but inside I felt my strength growing with each moment. "And now everything is under my control. The $5 million you tried to claim is fully accounted for, and the $2 million you didn't even suspect is my rightful share." Her shoulders sank a few centimeters, her gaze growing less confident. "But," she began, trying to find an anchor, but the words stuck. I stepped closer and placed my hand on the table beside the documents. "You tried to use the trust and weaknesses of our family for your own purposes. Now you see the consequences." I watched as she struggled to keep her emotions in check. "You received only what you expected. Everything else is mine." Lillian sank onto the sofa, her hands trembling. She began quietly, then fell silent again. Words were insufficient to express the mix of horror and confusion. I stepped toward the window, looking at the rain. "Control is understanding what is real, not what we want." Turning back to her, I continued. "Now you see that no trick will work. Everything you built is destroyed, and everything is confirmed by the documents." She raised her eyes, full of a mixture of anger and fear. She whispered, her voice shaking. "You could have at least shared," I asked softly, but every word was sharp as a blade. "I shared the opportunity, Lillian, but you chose secrecy and deceit." I paused, watching her try to compose herself. "Now you see the consequences." Silence stretched for several long seconds. Lillian looked at the documents, then at me, trying to comprehend what had happened. There was an inner struggle in her movements, but her former confidence was gone. "All this," she finally said, "you really—" "Yes," I replied firmly, slowly returning to the table. "Now everything is visible. You got only what you expected. The rest is my reality. I carefully spread the last documents before her. Every step you planned is now known. She sat, lowering her head, her breathing uneven. Her eyes reflected a mixture of anger, fear, and defeat. I understood that the moment we had been building toward for days had arrived. She could no longer influence, plan, or manipulate. You think that's all? She whispered, almost inaudibly. I slowly lifted my gaze, meeting her eyes. No words are needed, Lillian. Everything is clear through actions and documents. Inside me, a sense of confidence and control bubbled. Now you see reality, not illusions. Lillian sat motionless, her shoulders gradually dropping, her hands trembling. I watched every movement, understanding that the psychological victory had been achieved. She knew that her actions were fully exposed and that no move would have any effect anymore. I sat opposite her, folding my hands on the table, looking at her calmly. Everything you planned is exposed. Everything you wanted to hide is now known. My voice was steady but firm. You see that everything is under my control. She remained silent, internally defeated, and I could see her vanity and pride gradually collapsing. Her gaze swept across the folders and documents, then fell to her hands. Everything she could have said was now meaningless. I understand, she said quietly, almost a whisper, that I cannot. I nodded, not interrupting. Exactly, and now everything is clear. Lillian sat on the sofa, her head lowered, and I saw her body gradually relax, though her eyes still darted, searching for any way to circumvent the situation. I knew she was fighting internally, but every step, every movement indicated that the power was now fully on my side. I can't believe everything was revealed so easily, she said quietly, almost to herself, but I heard every word. I thought I could. Thinking isn't enough, I replied calmly, keeping my gaze fixed. To control the situation, you must fully understand it. You underestimated that. Her hands clenched into fists, and she looked back at the documents. You checked everything, every signature, every account. Everything, I confirmed. I knew what you were trying to hide, and now I have full verification. I slowly laid out a few more envelopes with additional details so she could see everything herself. The $5 million you tried to claim, and Father's hidden $2 million. Your attempt at deceit is now impossible. She ran a hand over her face, trying to hide both tears and anger. But how could you see everything? Her voice was almost a whisper, full of amazement. I sat nearby, not too close, leaving space, but every movement of mine was calculated. I observed, analyzed, verified. I knew you would try to act secretly. I paused to let her feel each word. And now you see the result. Lillian looked away, her shoulders trembling. She understood that any attempt to argue was futile. All this, she began, but again the words stuck. I didn't expect, I finished for her. You weren't ready for your actions to become known, and now everything is revealed. I watched her reaction, seeing how internally she came to terms with the truth. Silence stretched again for several long seconds. Lillian sat straighter, her hands lowered, breathing steadier, but her gaze still wandered across the documents. And what now? She asked quietly. Now you understand that control can only be over what is real, I replied calmly. You see that any attempt to manipulate is futile. Everything you planned is now known, and no trick will work again. She lowered her head, her hands clenched in her lap, and I saw vanity, anger, and pride gradually giving way to the realization of defeat. You really checked everything, she whispered, barely believing her own words. Yes, everything, I confirmed. And now I have full understanding of the situation. I stepped toward the window, watching the rain gradually ease. You see that your attempts were futile. Lillian remained silent, internally defeated, and I understood. The psychological pressure had reached its maximum. Her shoulders sank even lower, breathing evened out, but her eyes reflected both shock and acceptance. She knew that no new attempt to change the situation would help. I sat back at the table, folding my hands over the documents, watching her gradually comprehend the full weight of her position. All of this is not about money, Lillian, I said quietly. It's about who understands the situation and controls it. You tried to manipulate and hide, and now you see it is impossible. Her gaze flicked to the envelopes, to the folders, then down to her hands. I could see fear, anger, and disappointment mixed in her eyes. She understood that everything she could have done was now known and useless. "I understand," she whispered, "that nothing can be changed anymore." I nodded, watching her with quiet calm, inwardly feeling full control of the situation. "Now you see the truth, Lillian. Everything is revealed. Everything is under control." I looked again at the documents, the numbers, the signatures. Every envelope was proof that her actions were now meaningless. She sat motionless, breathing steady, shoulders relaxed. In her eyes, I saw not only fatigue and defeat, but also the realization that resisting me was now impossible. I slowly rose, walked to the window, and looked outside. The rain gradually eased, and the evening lights reflected on the wet cobblestones. I felt calm and confident. Everything necessary to restore control had been done. She understood that now any step was her responsibility, and she could not change the reality that had been established. "Everything is clear now," I said quietly, not averting my gaze from Lillian. "You see that any attempts at control are futile." She remained silent, eyes fixed on the documents. Her expression reflected a mixture of acceptance, realization, and internal defeat. I knew that every step, every decision would now stem only from her understanding that everything was under control, and that no new tricks would work. I returned to the table, sat down, watching her. "Everything is open, everything verified." I took a deep breath, feeling the tension gradually ease. "Now we know the truth, and it will not change." Lillian sat motionless, breathing steady, eyes lowered to her hands. All that remained was silence, heavy and tense, but now it was filled with the understanding that the past and actions were revealed, and control had been restored. Morning came slowly, soft light poured through the blinds, but the house felt heavy. Lillian sat on the couch, shoulders dropped, eyes still full of fatigue and inner anxiety. I watched her from a distance, feeling a cold certainty. Now control was entirely in my hands, but satisfaction was mixed with quiet bitterness. "Hannah," she began, choosing her words, but her voice trembled. I don't know what to say." I sat opposite her, hands on my knees, looking at her calmly. "You don't have to say anything, Lillian. Words don't matter here." I paused so she could feel the weight of the moment. "Everything that was hidden is now known. Everything you tried to claim is now under control." She lowered her eyes to the floor, her face pale, lips slightly trembling. "I understand," she whispered faintly. "You won. This is not a victory in the usual sense," I said quietly but firmly. "This is the restoration of order and understanding." I slowly looked around the documents on the table. "What Dad left belongs to me. Everything you intended to use is now known." Lillian sat up straighter but remained tense inside. "And what will happen between us now?" she asked almost in a whisper, as if afraid to hear the answer. I took a deep breath. The inner fatigue and weight of all the past days felt throughout my body. "Between us," I began, choosing my words, "between us will be what there is. You made your decisions, I made mine. We will no longer be those who can fully trust each other." My voice was even, but every word carried weight. "That is a fact." Her eyes met mine for a moment, full of regret and realization. "So, it's all over?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I replied calmly. "It's all over." I looked at the folders, the numbers, the signatures. "Every step you took is now known. Every plan of yours has been analyzed and neutralized." Lillian lowered her gaze and clasped her hands on her knees. I saw vanity, anger, and hope gradually give way to realization. She understood that regaining control was impossible. She began again, but the words got stuck. "I made mistakes." "Yes," I nodded quietly. "Mistakes that cannot be corrected." I made a light gesture with my hand to indicate that there would be no more conversation. "Now every step depends only on your decisions, and you cannot change what has happened." Her shoulders dropped even lower, her breathing became steadier, but her eyes still reflected a mixture of bitterness and resignation. "I understand," she whispered. That what was cannot be returned. Yes, I confirmed. And now we see the truth. I looked at the documents again. Everything that was hidden is now revealed. Everything you planned can no longer be undone. Silence stretched for several minutes. Lillian sat motionless, internally defeated. I watched her, feeling a strange mix of triumph and sadness. Control was restored, but the loss of connection with my sister gave a quiet bitterness. Do you understand everything, Lillian? I asked quietly, almost in a whisper. She slowly nodded, her gaze fell to the floor. Yes, she replied barely audibly. I understand everything. I sat back at the table, watching her gradually accept the new reality. Inside me remained a sense of inner calm, but also a quiet emptiness from the fact that the relationship with my sister had now changed forever. The day slowly turned to evening. The sun's rays disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving a soft dusk in the room. Lillian sat on the couch, head lowered, and I saw her gaze still wandering over the documents, as if trying to find even the slightest chance to change the situation. But there was none. I never thought it would end like this, she said quietly, almost in a whisper. Her voice was filled with a mix of regret and fatigue. I turned to her, eyes soft but firmly fixed on every gesture. Everything is exactly as it should be, I said calmly. You made your choice, and now the consequences are visible. She slightly raised her head, her eyes met mine. In her gaze was a mixture of anger, confusion, and bitterness. I thought I could get around everything, she said, and the words stuck in her throat. Get around? I repeated. Lillian, you underestimated the situation. You thought you could hide actions, manipulate numbers and documents, but reality turned out differently. I paused, observing her reaction. Now everything is known and no trick will work anymore. She sat up straighter, hands clasped on her knees. But, she began again, and for a moment her eyes flashed with determination. Maybe we could somehow. I gently shook my head. No, Lillian, now everything is clear. Every action of yours is known and control is restored. We can no longer be the same. I looked at the envelopes with documents. Everything you planned has no power anymore. She lowered her gaze, shoulders slowly relaxed, breathing became steadier. I understand, she said quietly, that what was cannot be changed. Yes, I confirmed. Now we see the truth. My voice was even, but inside there was relief and quiet bitterness at the same time. Everything is revealed, everything is verified. Everything you wanted to hide is now known. Lillian sat motionless, internally resigned. Her eyes fell on her hands, and I saw vanity, anger, and hope gradually give way to realization. She understood that any new attempts to change the situation were meaningless. I stood and walked to the window, looking at the garden, where rain had left wet traces on the paths. A light wind stirred the tree leaves, and inside me arose a feeling of strange calm. Control was restored, the situation was clear, but the price, the final estrangement from my sister, gave a quiet emptiness. Lillian, I said quietly, turning around, now every step you take will come only from your understanding, and you know that changing the past is impossible. She nodded, breathing even, shoulders relaxed. I understand, she whispered. I understand everything. I sat back at the table, watching her. Everything that was hidden is now known, I said, and now each of us goes our own way. My tone was calm but firm. You learned a lesson, I restored control. Lillian no longer tried to argue or look for loopholes. She just sat, quietly realizing her loss of influence and trust. Inside me, feelings mixed. Triumph and slight bitterness from the fact that the connection with my sister was now finally lost. She began again, but her voice was quiet and empty. I made too many mistakes. Yes, I nodded. And now you see the consequences. I looked at the documents, the signatures, the numbers. Everything is visible, and you can no longer influence the situation. Silence stretched, but she was already different. Calm, resigned to what had happened. I watched her, feeling the tension slowly fade. Control was restored, the truth was on my side, but the price was high. Loss of trust, final estrangement. Through the window, the last light of the departing day entered the room, and I realized that now everything had become clear. We made our choice, the consequences are visible, and life will go on, each on our own path. Lillian sat motionless, eyes focused on the documents. I took a deep breath, feeling a combination of calm, responsibility, and quiet sadness. Everything was finished, but the sense of emptiness remained.